welcome to our special segment on the U.S. versus China COVID-19 response battle. My name is Avanish. I'm one of the Coronawatch LC founders, and I'm joined here today with a resident of Beijing, Ryan Cunningham. He used to go to Farmwell, and he's back in D.C. Good to see you, Ryan.
Good to see you too.
So thank you for accepting our interview, and if you don't mind, let's just jump in.
All right.
So first things first, you've been in D.C. for how long?
I've been in DC since February. I think beginning of February. Yes.
So you've got to see firsthand how the two lockdowns are different between Beijing and Virginia.
In a way, yes, and in a way, no. Because lockdown really started end of January and beginning of February in Beijing, especially. In Wuhan, it was earlier, but in Beijing, it was a bit later in the end of January and February. But because it was during it all kind of started during a holiday, because we have the week-long Chinese New Year break, which was at the end of January this year. I was actually in Vietnam when my school closed. They said they would not reopen after the holiday. And a lot of our tournaments that were planned in February and March were all canceled, and a lot of other events in the region. So we then had to fly back. We had to fly back to China earlier than expected through Korea. And so we were in Beijing for a few days during the lockdown, but for the most part, we've been in here. Most of my classmates, though, and a lot of my friends and teachers have stayed in Beijing. So I have seen a lot of how the quarantine is in Beijing. But yeah.
So what are the key differences that you see, or like that your friends and classmates and teachers have seen?
In Vietnam, they did not have a lot of cases. They were not hit very early on. And I was in a more remote area, so it was not there wasn't much of a lockdown there. But the airlines, especially Vietnam Airlines, and it was becoming a lot harder to fly into China and out of China. So it was very difficult for us to get on a last minute flight via Jeju Air to Korea and then to Beijing. The lockdown in Beijing it was a lot more controlled, I think, than in the US, by, I would say, the federal government. In China, originally they relied more on the local governments in Wuhan to make sure that it didn't spread out of the city. But once it had already begun to spread throughout the nation, they relied more on federal action and federal response. There was a national level lockdown rather than state by state. So there was a closure of many different things, especially things like transportation. You could no longer travel domestically. Internationally was becoming increasingly difficult as airlines stopped their flights. So a lot of businesses, schools, different types of transportation, especially the railway, which is really, it's very big in China. They were all really closed. So you were kind of isolated in your city and couldn't go anywhere. And this left a lot of people stranded in places because they were on holiday for Chinese New Year. They were going to see their families, especially local Chinese. And so now they were stuck in different cities. So people in Wuhan could not go back to Beijing or Shanghai. They had to stay in Wuhan. And I think in the US, there's still like domestic travel. There's still a lot of things that were not stopped that were in China.
So you'd say that they were much more strict in China with all that stuff, and that's why they got over it quicker? And that's a good thing, or no?
I would say it's definitely very effective. In the beginning, it was kind of frowned upon by a lot of the world, and there were even some people in Wuhan who were sending like videos out via social media that were kind of criticizing the Chinese. But I think overall it was better because China, up until just recently, had gone almost back to normal, especially in like Beijing. In Wuhan, it took a little longer, but in like cities that were not as hit as hard as Wuhan, like Beijing and Shanghai, they were they were going a lot closer to normal than they were during the virus. And so I think overall it was a lot quicker. It was a lot more planned, and it helped things go back to normal better.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So you said that they were a lot more strict in China and there's a lot more domestic travel in the US. And do you think that contributes to case spike?
I do think it does. I do think it is because, well, you saw after Chinese, everyone was a little hesitant with China because they did not cancel the Chinese New Year break. They let people travel.
Yeah.
And so, but afterwards, all travel stopped. So people were kind of stuck in their cities. But you could already see that people who had left the big city of Wuhan to go to more rural areas, there was a spike following our break. Um, so I do think that it really contributes to cases, especially in like Beijing or Shanghai, where they're really big cities, and so it was really easy for them uh, it was very easy to spread.
Uh-huh.
And so that's why China had a lot of cases really early on, and there was a really big peak. Um, and so, and I think it also happened in other places like Italy where they could not track the first case, and because of travel, it continued to spread, and that's how it got into places like the U.S. And other international destinations.
So there's a lot of like scandals going on with Chinese media and stuff like,
Mhm.
are they concealing things? How early did they know about this? Stuff like that. So do you think the case number that China is reporting is accurate?
It's kind of hard to say. I do think they're in the beginning of the outbreak, in December, was when the first few cases were identified. It was not. A lot of people have said that it was not handled very well because the Chinese, they did not quite expect it to grow to such a level that it did. Over time, I think they did acknowledge that it was a problem, and so immediately in January and February, they started putting in restrictions to slow it while they still could. But by then, it had, of course, already spread to other places. Um, Overall, I think that early on, I think the cases were not quite as accurate because there was a lot of questioning on whether this had spread or whether this had escalated. But I think now, as the virus has grown and they've seen how big of a problem this is, they have become more accurate. So especially now with the new small outbreak in Beijing, I think I've seen how focused they are at trying to count the numbers and make sure no new cases are spread, no new cases are coming in. So I think, yeah, the farther on it came and it spread, the more accurate the numbers were.